Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste. We move forward with our summing up and discussion exercise. In the 10th module, we had a look at resources and conservation. And in the first lecture there, we had a look at land resources and agriculture. And we defined resource as a source of supply, support or aid that can be readily drawn upon when needed. So resource is a supply of something, a source of something that you can put to use whenever there is a need. So we can have things like natural resources, we can have things like machines, we can have things like equipment and software, or we can have human resources. So there are several different kinds of resources, and in each of them they are something, a source of supply, support or aid that can be readily drawn upon when there is a need. And in this context, natural resources are defined as those resources that exist without the actions of humans. So we do not need human action to create them or to sustain them. For example, rainforests. So if we humans do not overexploit these resources, they will continue to exist. They will continue to regenerate themselves, rejuvenate themselves. And so these are natural resources. And in this context, land is also a big natural resource. And if humans are not in the scene, then the land would be occupied by several different kinds of forests. And in that case, the forest will continue to exist without any human intervention. But we humans are putting land to other uses, and the land use has been changing with time. So if we look at the changes over time, we find that the proportion of land that is under cropland, that has been going up. The proportion of land that is under grazing is growing up. The proportion of land that is under built up area, that has been increasing. So we are putting land, we are taking land away from their natural uses, and we are putting the land into some sort of an artificial use or human use. Now the thing is, if today so much amount of land is under cropland or grazing or built up area, where did this land come from? And the answer is that we are putting land away from other uses such as forests or grasslands, and we are putting them to our own use. So this conversion of land from forest and grassland into human habitations, human farmlands and grazing areas, that is having conservation implications. And today, if we look at the land use pattern, we will find that agriculture dominates the current land use. So if you look at total Earth's surface, then 71% is oceans and only 29% is land, roughly 1/3. Now out of that 29%, 71% is habitable land, whereas others comprise glaciers and barren lands. Now out of this habitable land, as much as 50% is under agriculture. Only 37% is under forests and other is under scrub or other uses. So agriculture dominates the habitable land. And in this agriculture, the major share is taken up by livestock, meat and dairy. So this is as much as 77% of this 50%, and 23% is under cereals or other different crops. Now, if we look at the global calorie supply, we find that this much 77% of this land is able to provide for only 18% of the global calorie needs and only 37% of the global protein supply. which means that this is not a very efficient way of using up the land. Whereas this 23% is able to provide 82% of the world's calorie needs and 63% of the protein needs. So this is a much more efficient way of using the land resource. So essentially, if we increase this portion, then we can reduce the total amount of land that needs to be put under agriculture. So here we can see different action points. If you want to increase the forest cover, one way out is to increase the crops and reduce the livestock, and in that case the total calorie and protein supply can be met by a very small portion of land that needs to be put under agriculture. But the thing is, agriculture currently dominates the land use, and much of this increase has been coming from converting forests. And we looked at how this happens. So we looked at the example of Amazon rainforest. So this is Rondonia in 1975. And if you concentrate on this road remains the same in this next image from 1984. So roughly 10 years have passed. And here we can observe that there is deforestation that has already started. Then in the next 10 years, this is the situation. 10 more years and 10 more years. So roughly the forest has been completely wiped off. There is large scale deforestation, and much of this deforestation is happening not just to extract timber but also to convert this land into agricultural uses. Typically things like soybean or things like for grazing of animals, grazing of livestock. So this is actually happening at a very fast pace, and we are losing out on many of our forests. So this is a conservation implication of agriculture. But this is not the only conservation implication. There are also several other implications. Like if you look at greenhouse gases, then 26%, that is roughly 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions, is coming from the agriculture sector. We have seen that it is using 50% of the global habitable land. If you look at freshwater usage, then 70% of global freshwater withdrawals are happening only for agriculture. If you look at eutrophication, that is the movement of fertilizers and other nutrients into water bodies, leading to very large amount of growth of plants, algal bloom, and with the result of creation of anoxic conditions when these plants and algae die, and wiping up of all the life in that water body. So that is eutrophication. And if you look at the causes of eutrophication, 78% of eutrophication and other pollution is happening because of agriculture sector. If you look at the proportion of biodiversity on this planet, then 94% of all the mammalian biomass except humans is only because of the livestock. So we are now taking up all the space for that was there for all the different species, and we are using most of that space for livestock. So that has an implication for biodiversity, because we have seen before that in the case of biodiversity, you have more biodiverse regions when you have more number of species and an equitable distribution of numbers between various species. Now in this case, because livestock are dominating everything, then you have a situation where the biodiversity is actually going down. So this is another indicator. So there are several impacts. Also we have impacts. So we have looked at deforestation, but deforestation also leads to soil erosion, because once the cover of trees and grasses and plants is lost, then the soil becomes exposed, and when there is even a small amount of rainfall, the soil will get eroded. If winds blow fast, the soil will become eroded. And so deforestation is also leading to impacts such as soil erosion. Now this eroded soil is going to act as sediments, and these sediments are going to accumulate somewhere. So there is now an increased sedimentation in other areas. Typically our dams are also getting sedimented and they are losing out on their lives. But at the same time, we are also seeing large amounts of sedimentation in other areas like deltas or in areas such as the floodplains. Now, if there is more amount of sedimentation, then that also increases the frequency and intensity of floods. Because if the rivers are depositing the sediments, then the river bank increases in height, and so the rivers change their course. Once that happens, we have a situation of flood, which is a disaster for people and for animals. Then it is leading to climate change, it is leading to increase in soil salinity and alkalinity. That is changes in the chemical composition of soil. Typically because we are overusing the fertilizers. Fertilizers are chemicals. They are salts. And when we are adding fertilizers, we are increasing the salinity of the soil. We are altering the alkalinity of the soil. At the same time, there has been a very rapid and rampant use of groundwater or say river water, surface water for irrigation purposes. Now earlier the surface water, because it is coming from the mountainous areas, it is playing a big role in weathering and erosion, and it is carrying a large amount of salts that were there in the form of minerals in different rocks. Now if we did not act, then these salts would have been slowly drained away into the seas and oceans. And because of the water cycle, the water gets evaporated, leaving behind the salts, and which is why our seas and oceans are so salty. This is a result of millions of years of taking out of salts from different areas and depositing them in the seas and the oceans. But when we take this water, we spread it on the land, then the same deposition also happens in the case of land. So when you take this water for irrigation, spread it on top of land, then the water will get evaporated, but the salts that are there in that water, they will get deposited in the soil, which is also leading to increase in salinity. Now because of these changes in chemical composition plus use of lots of pesticide, we are also seeing the death of soil biota. So the soils are dying, the organisms are dying, and so the soils are becoming sterile soils without any life forms. We are observing death of pollinators, reduction of biodiversity. There is waterlogging, there is water contamination, there is eutrophication when all of these fertilizers are getting washed up into different water bodies. There is a large scale disruption of food chains, because when we use large quantities of pesticides and insecticides, then we are disrupting the food chains. We are killing off a large number of organisms that were being used as food by other organisms. And not only that, the pesticides are getting accumulated in their bodies. So there is bioaccumulation, there is biomagnification of pesticides, and that is also hampering the biodiversity in upper levels. There is disruption of water flow. There is subsidence of land, because when we are increasing the load on the land because we are adding lots of water, in that case the land becomes heavy and it begins to subside. It begins to go down. Then there are impacts of genetically modified crops that are again impacting biodiversity, and there is also large scale pollution that is happening. Now this pollution is not just because of the release or usage of insecticides, pesticides and fertilizers, but there is also pollution happening for the generation of these chemicals, for the production of these chemicals, for the manufacturing of various agricultural implements and tools and machines, and for running them. So when somebody uses a tractor to plow the fields, the tractor also requires diesel to run. So there is a large scale pollution that can be traced to the agricultural sector. So there are large scale impacts that are happening. Then we looked at water resources, and in this case we saw that water is unequally distributed. So different areas have different amounts of water, and even if we look at per capita availability of renewable freshwater resources, we find that there is a huge variation. But even though there is a huge variation, we find that the water usage has been increasing with time, and it has been increasing everywhere, with the result that in large number of areas the availability is rapidly going down, and in many cases the extraction is much greater than the renewable availability. That is, the water that is being made available through the hydrological cycle, if that is amount X, then we are extracting an amount that is much greater than X, meaning that we are now depleting our water resources, we are depleting our water bodies, because the extraction is greater than the renewable availability of water. And we looked at the case study of RLC. So RLC in 1974, that was a very large size water body, but over time we have completely wiped it off. And here again the main reason was agriculture, because the waters of Sir Darya and Amu Darya rivers that were draining into the RLC, that water was diverted for agricultural uses, for promoting cotton cultivation. Now, if you have a water body and there are rivers that are providing it with fresh water, if you cut down those rivers, if you take out that water, then the water that remains in the water body, in this case the RLC, that would slowly begin to evaporate. And when it began to evaporate, then slowly and steadily the RLC began to shrink in size. Now, not only that, it also resulted in an increase in the salinity, because the water was diluting the salts, and when the water amount was reduced, then the concentration of salts increased. Now, we have observed before that different organisms have a limit of tolerance to their environmental conditions. And when the salt levels increased, then we had a situation where the fish died. Different organisms that were living in the RLC, they started to get wiped off one by one. And with that, we also saw large amounts of changes in the lifestyle of people, because the fishing industry died down because of the absence of fishes. The tourism industry died down. And at the same time, we also started to observe large number of environmental calamities, such as the blowing of salts in different areas. So with the winds, the salts were getting moved into different areas, even into human habitations. That resulted in increase in salinity into far off areas, which also resulted in a reduction in the capacity of soil to produce crops. Then the pollutant load also increased, it became more and more concentrated, with the result that the nearby communities began to see large number of diseases. The abortion rate went up. Now, not just because the pollutants were getting concentrated, but at the same time they were getting enhanced, because there was large scale agriculture in the vicinity. So we have observed that because of all of these changes, through time the RLC got converted from a very large water body into a minuscule water body. So what can we do to conserve our water resources? One, we have to reduce the usage. We cannot go on using large amounts of water. We have to cut down. The usage of water resources has to be sustainable. We should only be using that amount of water that is necessary for meeting our needs, because we also have to save water for our future generations. So we have to cut down on water usage. We need to increase the recharge into our water bodies, recharge into the groundwater, and we need to protect what is available. So these are three things that are necessary to conserve the water resources. And in this context, we saw that a very easy thing is to construct a thing known as a rain garden. You don't have to do many things, you just have to keep a plot of land available, let plants grow, and whenever there is rainfall, then these plants would slow down the speed of water and they will promote infiltration of water into the groundwater. As simple as that. Then we looked at mineral and energy resources, and here we saw that minerals are unequally distributed on this planet. But we have an increasing resource demand whether we talk of any resource, there is an increasing resource demand. And because of that, we are now overexploiting the resources. To overexploit the mineral resources, to overexploit the energy resources, we are doing more and more amount of mining. And this mining is having several severe environmental consequences. So we are observing things like deforestation. So to extract the minerals, you have to remove the tree cover so that you can access those minerals, and so there is deforestation. When there is mining, the areas are getting exposed, and so there is a heavy amount of soil erosion. And here again, the soil is getting sedimented into some other locations. We are creating sinkholes. We are doing large amount of water pollution, especially when we are taking out those minerals that are rich in heavy metals. So that is causing a huge amount of water pollution, huge amount of toxicity. And because of all of these, there is a heavy loss of habitats. So what can we do to conserve our resources? One, here again, we have to reduce our resource usage, but if we have to do mining, at least avoid setting up of oil rigs and mines in especially vulnerable biodiversity spots. That is, we know where the biodiversity hotspots are. Now, at least in those locations, we have to be very firm. We have to say that no, we are not going to permit any mining here. Because already there are very few spots that are left for biodiversity. And if we do not conserve them, the biodiversity will be lost forever. Because once a species is extinct, there is no bringing it back. Then we need to have measures to prevent spills and accidents with better technologies. So when we are doing mining, when we are setting up a mine, we should not be cutting costs, especially on protective devices, especially on those devices that help us prevent accidents. Because if we cut costs there, if there is a spillage, if there are accidents, then we are exacerbating the impacts of mining manifold. We need to develop models to anticipate the spread of pollutants. So if any accident happens, we should know where the pollutants will go so that we can act in time and we can make a difference. We need to maintain rapid response teams and technologies. Utilize studies on long-term impacts and mitigation options. Studies have to be done, and those studies should not just remain there in the reports, they have to be put to use. We need to improve the degraded habitats and especially targeting priority areas. And when we talk about improving the degraded habitats, we have several options that are available. One is the option of recovery or neglect. We let nature take its own course. That is, once we have done mining, there is a degraded habitat, we do not do anything. We let nature do its own magic. That is, with the passage of time, there will be ecological succession. There will be plants that will come up that are able to survive in those toxic conditions, and slowly, because of bioremediation, phytoremediation, we will observe that the concentration of the heavy metals would go down, and slowly the area would get converted into a good habitat. But the problem with this approach is that in the time that it takes to do the ecological succession, it is possible that there will be heavy amount of soil erosion and the habitat will be lost forever. So that is always an issue with taking this approach. So it may ameliorate the degraded habitat or it can make it even more degraded. Examples including leaving land fallow. Another option is rehabilitation or reclamation, where we shift the degraded habitat towards a greater value, not necessarily the original state, but we try to improve the value. So we can say at least try to plant certain species. Another option is restoration, which is actively trying to return the habitat to its original state. Now in this case, we will not do any plantation, but we will do plantation of those species that were originally found in the area. So we are trying to move the degraded habitat back to the original state. Then we have the option of enhancement, which is improving the value of the habitat by, say, construction of water holes for animals. And we have the option of replacement, which is creating a new habitat in the place of the degraded habitat. So example is, if you have a forest, you did mining, there are mining pits that have been formed. So we can do some earthwork to cover these pits and fill them with water and create a marshy wetland. Now earlier we had a forest, but now we have a wetland habitat. So this is the option of replacement. So this can work if we do not have sufficient resources to bring the habitat back to the original state, or if it is much easier and it is much quicker to change it into another habitat. So these are several options that we have. We can do neglect, reclamation, restoration, enhancement, or replacement. And especially in the case of mine restoration, there are several measures that have to be taken. The waste dumps have to be flattened, the landfills have to be flattened so as to prevent erosion. The dug pits have to be filled up. So all of this material from the waste dumps and landfills, that should be used to fill up the dug pits. Then all of this has to be covered with a layer of clay to prevent access to rain and oxygen. Then covered with a layer of topsoil, and then plantation done, so that the habitat is now improved. And at the same time, we have to perform evaporation of the tailings dams, where the water that was going to leach out, that is collected, and that water being rich in the heavy metals, that should be evaporated to concentrate those heavy metals, and then those heavy metals should be taken to some other areas and disposed properly. So these are the several activities that have to be done for mine restoration. Now in this case, what are the action points? One is reduce, reuse and recycle, because the resources are finite and making any product needs resources, lots of resources. And so when we talk about reducing our impacts on the planet, reducing our usage of minerals and energy resources, then the first thing that we need to do is to reduce our use of anything, reuse things as far as possible, recycle things as far as possible, because by doing these we will be able to conserve a lot of mineral and energy resources. Next, we need to adjust our behavior. Switch off unnecessary lights, because in any case they are not serving any purpose. Use more energy efficient devices so that we cut down on the energy use. We can use more insulation or use clothing as per the climate. So here again our heating and cooling costs will go down. Use full loads in washing machines. Now, this is not a tough thing to do. Go solar or use more renewable resources. It's free. Options include solar cookers, solar water heaters, solar panels and so on. And in this case we can explore the RESCO model, because unlike the CAPEX model, it doesn't require any money to set up. We can talk to our representatives, highlighting the need to conserve resources, discuss their plans about it, and explore passive heating and cooling options such as using shades or curtain or water. And in this case we looked at the example of passive cooling of rooftops. So in this case we can cover up the rooftop so that less amount of sunlight is able to reach to the rooftop, and we can use the option of evaporation using water so that the rooftop cools down. And in this case we will be able to reduce our expenses and at the same time save the planet. Then in the 11th module we had a look at economic geography and conservation, and we began with transport and communication networks. Now in this case we saw that we are living in an increasingly connected world. So the connectivity of various places has improved a lot in the past few decades, and now we are very well connected through several modes. So these modes include roads, railways, shipping lines, inland waterways, airways, pipelines, and communication networks such as personal communication networks and mass communication networks. And all of these connections are forming networks, which is defined as nodes that are joined by links to form a pattern. And these modes are enriching our lives, but they are also having conservation implications. And in this case, we looked at the case study of linear infrastructure. Now, linear infrastructure are defined as those basic physical and organizational structures and facilities needed for the operation of a society or enterprise that can be represented as straight or curved lines. So, they are infrastructure, that is, infra is below, so they are structures that are below, that are supporting everything else, and they are linear, meaning that they can be represented in the form of lines. So, examples of linear infrastructure include things like roads, railways, power lines, canals, pipelines, and so on. And all of these are infrastructures that can be represented in the form of lines. Now, the issue is that roads kill biodiversity. So, roads kill, they also cause pollution, lots of pollution. We have air pollution because of the exhaust of various automobiles. We have air pollution because of the dust that gets into the air. We have sound pollution, not only because of the honking of horns, but also because the engines are running. We also have lots of light pollution, especially in night times. Roads act as barriers to wildlife movement, and by acting as barriers, they constrain the wildlife into smaller areas. So essentially, they are doing fragmentation of habitats. So in place of having a continuous habitat, now if you have a road, then even though this road takes up a very small percentage of area, talking area wise, but it has a huge impact because it has fragmented this habitat into these smaller patches. Construction of roads and other linear infrastructure often causes lots of loss and destruction of habitat. You have to cut trees, you have to fill up land, you have to do a lot of earthwork. So that causes a lot of loss and destruction of habitat. And once the roads have been constructed, they facilitate the destruction of habitat because they permit access into the wildlife areas. And so people can get inside to cut trees, to girdle trees. People can get inside to poach animals, hunt animals. People can get inside to graze their animals and result in a habitat displacement. Roads increase interaction with humans, often with tragic consequences not just for the wildlife but also for humans because they lead to accidents. They change animal behavior. So animals completely change their behavior from being shy of humans. They now become very much attuned to humans. And in a large number of cases, that also increases the accidents, that also increases the cases of conflicts when animals are able to attack humans because they now are not fearful of humans. In many cases, we have observed that the animals are getting into conflicts with humans. And the way out is to use mitigation measures, which are measures to avoid, reduce, or remedy harm. So these are as simple as constructing a land bridge. So in the case of a land bridge, the animals can move over the road, and so the fragmentation is reduced. Or we can construct our bridges in such a manner that animals are able to use the space below and move from one area to another area. So here again we will reduce the amount of fragmentation that the road is causing. Or as simple things as maintaining canopy connectivity. When we have canopy connectivity, then at least the animals that live on the trees, they do not have to get on the road to cross the area. They can move using these canopies without getting on the road. So that reduces the chances of accidents by a large measure. Next, we had a look at trade. And we saw that trade happens because it is much more rational for people to buy things that are cheaply available as compared to making them. So people never attempt to make at home what it will cost them more to make than to buy. And it is in their own self-interest. And because people are guided by this self-interest, so we cannot use a means to reduce this trade, or rather we should not use a means to reduce this trade, otherwise we will be hampering the self-interest of everybody. And they try to make things where they have certain advantages over their neighbors or as compared to others, and these things are made in a quantity that is much greater than what people need to use themselves. And once they have the excess, then this excess can be traded for other goods. So in the case of trade, it permits people to make those things that they are most efficient in making, and this reduces the cost for the society as a whole. So trade has very important implications for the welfare of people, and which is why trade is happening. If you look at international trade, then there are gains for the exporting country. So in this case, we saw that if we plot the demand curve and the supply curve, the point where they meet gives us the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity demanded or supplied in the market. Now, export happens when the world price, that is the price in the international market, is greater than the domestic price. And so when you have this red line that shows the world price, so this becomes the de facto price that at which trade happens. Now in this case, because the prices have gone up, so the consumer surplus goes down, but the producer surplus increases a lot. And overall, earlier we had a surplus that was given by this triangle, but now we have this area of D that has been added. So it increases the total surplus. So there are gains for the exporting country. Similarly, if you look at the importing country, a country imports when the world price is less than the domestic price. That is, things are available cheaply in the international market, whereas it costs the country more to make them at home. Now in this case, when the price goes down, so this world price is the de facto trading price in the market, so the price has gone down, and in this case the producer surplus reduces, but the consumer surplus increases. And in this case as well, we have an increase in this amount of D. So it increases the total surplus that is there, and because of that it is gainful for the importing country. So whether the countries are going for an export or an import, it is useful for them, and which is why they are engaging in the trade. But the thing is, trade also has several conservation implications. Trade increases world pollution, even moving across boundaries, and it helps to undermine national emission reduction targets. So there are large amounts of conservation implications of trade. So trade is going to happen because trade is useful for both importing and exporting countries, and basically trade is in the benefit of everybody. But then we have to be mindful of what we are trading. So if we are engaging in a trade of goods that has huge environmental consequences because it has not been sustainably harvested, in those cases we will have to say a no, even though it will reduce our surplus. So basically here again we are talking about sustainability. In the short run, we might feel that okay, we could have had this good at a cheaper price, but then because this cheap price is coming through destruction of forests, through loss of habitats, destruction of biodiversity, so in the long run that is going to be extremely expensive for us, because we will lose out on the ecosystem services benefits. And so in these cases we have to be mindful of what we are purchasing. So we cannot wish trade away, but we have to be mindful of things. Next we had a look at settlements, and we defined settlement as cluster of dwellings of any type or size. And there are two kinds of settlements. We can have rural settlements dominated by primary economic activities with less mobility and more intimate relationships between people. And we also have urban settlements that are dominated by secondary or tertiary economic activities and typically have more mobility and less intimate relationships between people. Now both of these are related because cities serve as centers of growth and employment, while villages supply the cities with people and food. and thus a good transport and communication network is essential to join the two. So we have two different kinds of settlements, but both of these are very much related. If you look at rural settlements, they are of four kinds. We can have clustered or agglomerated or nucleated settlements, or we can have semi-clustered or fragmented settlements, or we can have hamlets, or the settlements can be dispersed in the form of scattered settlements or isolated settlements. And this is governed by physical factors like terrain, altitude, climate, and the availability of water. Cultural factors like social structure, caste, and religion. And security factors like defense against theft, robberies, and so on. So basically, if you have to set up a common defense, you will tend to move towards more clustering, whereas if the terrain is such that that it is literally impossible to create houses close by, then you will move towards a dispersed settlement. So all of these factors govern which kind of settlement will there be. In the case of urban settlements, the towns are divided into statutory towns and census towns. Statutory towns are those places that have municipality or municipal corporation or cantonment board or a notified town area committee. Whereas census towns are those towns or those places that have a minimum population of 5,000 with at least 75% of the male working population engaged in non-agricultural pursuits and a density of population of at least 400 people per square kilometer. Now, based on the population sizes, we have different classification of towns. So, class 1 town has a population of more than 1 lakh people. Class 2 town has a population between 50,000 and 1 lakh. Class 3 town has a population between 20,000 and 50,000. Class 4 town has a population between 10 to 20,000. Class 5 town has a population of 5 to 10,000. And a class 6 town has a population of less than 5,000 people. Now, based on their functions, we can have a functional classification of towns such as administrative towns like New Delhi, or industrial towns like Bhilai, transport towns like Vishakhapatnam, commercial towns like Saharanpur, mining towns like Singrauli, garrison or cantonment towns such as Mau or military headquarters of war or Jalandhar, educational towns like the city of Oxford, religious and cultural towns like Varanasi, and tourist towns like Mussoorie. Now, urbanization is related with several problems. We have the issue of urban sprawls, which is unabated expansion further away from the central business district. Often the excessive sizes cannot be suitably managed, and so there is a mismanagement that happens. And typically this mismanagement is seen in the form of increased amount of pollution, increased amount of garbage in several locations. So now all of these are happening because the towns are expanding very fast, but we do not have a planning. They are not moving at a speed that permits planning. So that is an urban sprawl. We have the issues of overcrowding, especially near the central business district. There are issues of slums and squatter settlements where people are forced to live in those areas where they do not have sufficient amenities for a decent life. There is a shortage of housing that is again fueling the slums and squatter settlements, and we have inadequate waste treatment and pollution. Now the way out is to create more sustainable settlements, and when we talk about a sustainable settlement, it is a settlement that reduces its inputs. So it requires less amount of resources, and it reduces its inputs not only by increasing the efficiency but also by reusing the wastage. So basically the wastage is reduced, some part of the organic waste is recycled, some part of inorganic waste is recycled, and at the same time with more energy efficient buildings, more water efficient buildings, we cut down on the inputs and cut down on the wastage as well. Now in this case there are several action points. We need to have a provisioning of well functioning public transportation options and bike lanes if you want to have more sustainable cities. We need to plan the locations of infrastructures so that people have to travel less. We need to increase the energy efficiency everywhere, from homes to street lights to public amenities. We need to increase water efficiency through reduce and reuse of water, such as use of grey water recycling, efficient fittings, rain gardens, use of green materials with recycling and carbon storage capabilities, such as use of lightweight and recyclable materials, wood and local materials, and use of technology to improve efficiency, such as Internet of Things and smart city technologies. So basically, we cannot wish out urbanization because our populations are growing and people's aspirations are also growing. But we can at least plan our cities in a way that uses less amount of resources and generates less amount of waste. So that in that way, we will make our cities more and more sustainable. Then we have action points like use of gardens and landscaping to improve air quality, such as using vertical gardens, roof gardens, terrace gardens, kitchen gardens, rain gardens, efficient and effective waste management, and maximizing the usage of renewable energy resources. So basically, when you talk about a sustainable city, you can think about buildings that use very less amount of resources. So buildings have say solar panels on their top so that they are making their own electricity. Buildings that are using very less amount of water by using water efficient devices or by recycling and reusing the water, say for irrigation purposes, and so on. Then in the last module, we had a look at the special topics in geography and conservation, where we talked about remote sensing and GIS. Now, these are based on the science of photogrammetry, which is the science and technology of obtaining spatial measurements and other geometrically reliable derived products from photographs. And this is a form of remote sensing because there is acquisition of information about the target object or phenomenon without making a physical contact with the object. And it is based on the principle that triangulation permits depth perception. So we can create a 3D model of the area by doing a triangulation using several photographs. So through this way, once we have a 3D model, we can perform any number of spatial measurements. The method involves taking photographs from at least 2 different locations. Typically these days we make use of several locations because photography has become very cheap. We develop lines of sight from each camera to the points on the object, and in today's time these lines of sight are all done on a computer, and then we mathematically intersect these lines of sight to get 3D coordinates of the points of interest. And we make several products from aerial photography like digital elevation models, orthophotos, thematic GIS data, and other derived products and maps. Now in this context, GIS refers to Geographic Information System, which is a system consisting of hardware, software, and humanware that is designed to capture, store, manipulate, analyze, manage, present different kinds of geographical data. It is an integrated system to process and analyze geographical data, including those received through remote sensing. So we can use several different kinds of data here. Modern GIS technologies handle data in a digital format, and the data is represented in the form of layered stacks that are interconnected and can be queried. And the sources of data include satellite data, photographs, scanned copies of maps, data from old documents, topo sheets, GPS coordinates, field surveys, transits, description forms, cruises, and so on. Then we had a look at disasters. Now, disaster is defined as a catastrophe, mishap, calamity, or grave occurrence in any area arising from natural or man-made causes or by accident or negligence, which results in substantial loss of life or human suffering or damage to and destruction of property or damage to or degradation of environment, and is of such a nature and magnitude as to be beyond the coping capacity of the community of the affected area. And disasters are of several kinds. We have natural disasters like earthquakes, landslides, tsunami, and flood. And we also have human-made disasters like industrial accidents, oil spills, war and terrorist attacks. And in this context, we have to prepare for the disaster, which brings us to the disaster management cycle. For proper management of disasters, there are certain actions that have to be taken before the disaster, which are known as capacity building, and there are certain actions that have to be taken after the disaster, which include assessment and response. Now, capacity building includes the steps of prevention, mitigation, and preparedness, whereas assessment and response includes immediate help, reconstruction, and rehabilitation. So all of these together form the disaster management cycle. Then we had a look at the valuation of natural resources. And economic valuation of natural resources is essential to aid the cost benefit analysis when the natural resource is being diverted. So if a forest is being diverted into mining, then we need to know the value that was being provided by the forest and the value that we are going to gain from the mining activity. And only if the mining activity provides us with a value that is greater than the value provided by the forest should we go ahead with the mining operation. Now, for this, we need to know exactly how much amount of benefit the forest provides. But the issue here is that not everything that the forest is providing to us is traded in the market. And so we need to have other methods to perform the economic valuation. Similarly, we need economic valuation to provide evidence to aid habitat conservation policies by highlighting the economic value associated with conservation, such as watershed benefits. So basically, if there is a protected area that is providing us with watershed benefits, we need to know what are the amounts of benefits that this protected area is providing to us, because only then will we be able to justify the continuation of these protected areas. Only then we will be able to justify the continued existence of our forests, because otherwise we have already observed that land is in shortage. There is so much demand for land that people would want to divert the forest into other uses. So if you want to maintain your forest, if you want to maintain your natural resources, and that too primarily because they are providing you with certain benefits, you need to have a ready figure to tell people that we need to protect these forests because they are providing us with such and such values. And it is also essential to evaluate the economic compensation that is legally required for damage to natural resource through the polluter pays principle. So if there is a thing such as an oil spill or an industrial accident that results in a loss of habitats, so what is the amount of money that you have to charge to these people who have done this pollution so that there is a deterrence, and this deterrence has to be a reasonable deterrence. If somebody has damaged a natural resource that is worth say 100 crores, and if you are putting a fine of say 10,000 rupees, that just does not make any sense. So we need to do an economic valuation to come to the correct figure that needs to be charged from those people who are doing the pollution. Only then we will be able to internalize the externalities that are associated with pollution. And in this case, we looked at total economic value, which is a sum of the use value and the non-use value. So use value comes from using resources, non-use value comes even though the resources are not being used. Now use value is divided into direct values, indirect values and option value. And non-use value is divided into existence value, which is the benefit or value that is coming from the knowledge that a resource is continuing to exist, or altruistic value, which comes because somebody in the current generation is using the resource, and bequest value, which is what we leave for our future generations. And in this context, there are three accepted approaches for valuation. We have the market prices method, or the revealed willingness to pay, in which case people have already revealed how much amount they wish to pay for certain resources because they are being traded in the market. And these include things like market prices. They include hedonic pricing, which is the amount of extra money that people pay to get say access to a good view, or they include the travel cost method, which includes how much amount of money people actually are paying to travel to, say, a protected area or a forest and to look at or enjoy the surroundings. Then we have circumstantial evidence method, or the imputed willingness to pay, such as replacement or substitute cost, in which case we look at the cost of setting up, constructing and running a substitute or a replacement for certain facilities that the well-functioning ecosystems are providing to us for free. So, for example, things such as protection from storms or protection from tsunamis, or say purification of water or purification of air. What is the cost of setting up a substitute? Or we can look at the damage cost that is being avoided because we have a well-functioning ecosystem. And the third method is surveys or express willingness to pay, such as the contingent valuation method. And by using one or more of these methods, we can come to an economic valuation that can be used for decision making. So that's all for today. Thank you for your attention. Jai Hind.